In this video, we're going to talk about the last group of eukaryotic organisms, the Protista kingdom. Now, the Protista kingdom consists of both unicellular and large multicellular organisms. Those which are large are going to lack true tissue formation, though. We're going to look at the plant-like Protista known as algae. They're plant-like because they have photosynthetic abilities and some have cell walls. Those in contrast to the animal-like Protista, which are going to have the ability to move and don't have those cell walls, and those are known as protozoa. So let's first look at our algae. Now, when we talk about algae, what you're going to need to take away with it, what are the major groups, how are they classified, and some of those examples, as well as just the general characteristics of algae. Algae are going to be simple eukaryotic organisms. Some are going to be small and unicellular, others are going to be quite large. You're going to find them in aqueous environments, and as I already mentioned, they are going to have photosynthetic properties. Algae, however, are not themselves going to be human pathogens, but they are important because there are some unicellular microscopic organisms which produce toxins which are harmful to the humans when ingested. So we do need to look at them, and they do have some interest in microbiology. Also, algae have a huge number of benefits for us. For one, they're going to be major producers of oxygen. In addition, between the diatoms and the planktons, we're going to have a large production and storage of petroleum and natural gas. So let's look at those 5 groups of algae. Again, know the major classifications and know those examples that we discuss. So loosely, the algae are going to be classified based on their colors. So the first one is the Phyophyta, which is the kelp, and it's also referred to as brown algae. These are all going to be very large, macroscopic, with some of them being up to 50 meters long. You know this group quite well from living at the beach because this is the group the seaweed belongs to. So brown algae is harvested and used for a lot of different products, things such as tires and ice cream, for example. Now, the red algae is called Photophyta, and it is going to be, again, multicellular, quite large, and it's going to be found at the depth of the ocean. And why it's going to be found down there is because it's called red algae because it has a red pigmentation, and that red pigmentation allows it to absorb the lights that penetrate deep in the water and get to the deeper levels. Now, red algae is important to microbiology and actually to baking as well because it's what we use to make agar. Now, remember, agar is a thickening substance, so we use it in microbiology because we took the nutrient broth, we mixed 1 to 2% agar in that broth, and it makes it into that solid nutrient agar. Then we have our green algae, known as Chlorophyta. Now, green algae is going to be usually microscopic. It's sometimes going to be multicellular, oftentimes unicellular, but most often microscopic, and it's going to be found at the surface of water. It's very similar in plants in the fact that they have cellulose cell walls, and they contain that chlorophyll A and B, hence they're green in color and called green algae. Now, the diatoms. Diatoms are unicellular. They're often referred to as filamentous algae because they have such unique shapes. Diatoms are often said to be like snowflakes because snowflakes, every one is supposed to be individual. Same thing with diatoms. Each one is a unique shape, and why is because they have very complex cell walls made up of silica or calcium. Diatoms are very important for us for 2 reasons. One is because they're a major source of stored energy in the form of oils. Also, because they are microscopic and they are a major food source for some of the ocean inhabitants, such as mussels, that when mussels eat a large amount of diatoms and ingest it and have it within their tissues, then when people eat those mussels and digest those diatoms, they get a toxin from the diatoms that causes neurological disease. The last group is what we call the Dinophyta or the dinoflagellates. They are going to be unicellular, free-floating, okay? And genus Alexandrium is the big one. Now, one of the things that I do want you to know about the Dinophyta is that there is a group known as the Carina brevis, and it is responsible for red tides. Now, at the beach, that's important for you to understand because, as you know, red tides can cause sickness for humans. And why? Because, like the diatoms, the dinophyta produce toxins. So when they get consumed by fish, marine mammals, and even those mussels and shellfish that humans eat, if humans eat those shellfish or mussels that have a high concentration of dinophyta, they will end up with those neurotoxins and have that neurological disease again. So again, one thing to point out is that it's the dinophyta that produce red tides, okay, not red algae. So just keep that in mind. Okay, moving from our algae, now let's move to our animal-like Protista. Okay, and in this group, these are going to be animal-like because they are classified by their ability to move. So there's 4 basic groups based on motility: the Mastigophora, the Sarcodina, the Sillophora, and the Apicomplexa. Now, the one thing about the protozoa is they have very complex life cycles where they go through various stages. For this unit, we're just doing our introduction to protozoa, so all you're going to have to know is the basics. When we get to our disease units toward the end of the semester, then you're going to have to know more specifics about each of those life cycles. But for this unit, this is an introduction only, and it's terminology and some examples. Do know that the protozoa can live in soil and or water depending on their nature, but they do lack a cell wall, which is another reason that it is an animal-like and not plant-like Protista. The protozoa themselves can cause harm to humans. Unlike when we talked about the algae, where it's the toxins that can cause harm, in the protozoa, the organism itself can cause harm. So, again, I mentioned that protozoa have a complex life cycle, so let's talk a little bit about some of that terminology. So, in the adult or feeding stage of the protozoa life cycle, many of them are going to have a flagella or some ability to move. And when they're in that feeding adult mobile stage, they're called trophozoites. Now, there are times when these protozoa will get into an environmental condition in which they're not able to reproduce or survive well, and so they go into a protective form, and when they go into that protective form, it's known as a cyst. Okay, very similar when we were dealing with bacteria and we talked about sporulation. When they produce cyst, again, it's not a reproductive form, it's a survival mode. And the reason you need to understand that is because when we get to the disease chapters, sometimes the way they cause harm to humans is because we ingest them in the cyst form, and sometimes it's trophozoites. So make sure you know those terms. And again, they will go back and forth depending on the environment, and that enables them to survive. If environment is good, they go to the trophozoite stage and they feed and they eat. If the environment is harsh and they're not able to survive well, then they go into the cystic phase. So just examples of where you have, for instance, here to the left, you have the trophozoite phase, and you can see it has flagella here versus the cystic phase. So let's talk about the various groups of protozoa. Again, they're classified based upon their motility. So the first group is the Mastigophora. They use flagella for motility, and they can possess more than one flagella. Might be one, might be more. And because these are eukaryotic organisms, remember how flagella move in eukaryotic organisms. It goes back and forth in a whip-like motion. Now, when we talk about that they're in that flagellate stage, having the flagella, they don't have mouths or anything to ingest, rather that they will use what's known as an oral groove or a cytostoma, okay? And you'll see some pictures over here to the left, and here is that flagella. In this case, it's just a single flagella. Now, just as an introduction, there are several important pathogens. We're going to talk about just 2. The first one is the Trypanosoma brucei gambinzi, which is going to cause African sleeping sickness, whereas Trypanosoma cruzi causes Chagas disease, which is a cardiovascular disease. So the Trypanosoma have several pathogens for them, and they are flagellated, as you can see right here. Okay, the next group is the Sarcodinia. Now the Sarcodina, these are going to be your amoeboid-like cells, okay? And you've heard of amoebas, you've probably even seen amoeba, and they use the pseudopod for their motion. So unlike mastigophora, which uses the flagella, the Sarcodina use the pseudopods. And they will use that pseudopod to push that foot out, and then it can pull food back in and undergo engulfing food through phagocytosis. Now, Sarcodinas are very infamous for causing dysentery, and it can be various severities. So, for instance, there's Entamoeba histolytica, which that one will then come into the human body, and it feeds on red blood cells, causing dysentery and internal cysts. Then you have the meningitis encephalitis, which can be caused by Naegleria fowleri, and that one is one that you hear about sometimes in the news because it comes from people swimming in warm waters. What makes this one so significant is that it's considered to have a 100% mortality rate. Now, to date, I believe there's one person who has survived, but the number is, you can count on one hand. So again, it's considered to be a high rate of mortality. The next group is the Cilophora, and as you probably can get from the name here, it's a little bit more direct. Cilia is going to be how this one moves, and it will also use that cilia. Remember when we discussed cilia in a previous video, that the cilia can also help it absorb nutrients. So in this case, it's absorbing nutrients and helps it feed. There's only one known human pathogen out of the Cilophora, and that's the Bacillium coli, and it's going to cause some significant intestinal infections in humans and also in pig. So you've heard of E. coli, this is the B. coli. The last group is the Apicomplexia, and as I said, we've gone through flagella and cilia and pseudopods as ability to move. Well, the Apicomplexia and their adult forms, mature forms, actually are not motile, and so sometimes they're called sporozoa because they are not motile. They are going to be obligate intracellular parasites, meaning that in order for them to be parasitic, they have to be gotten into the cells. Now, we will look at a couple of Apicomplexia when we get to the disease unit, and one of the things that you'll need to recognize is they have very complex cell cycles, or life cycles, excuse me, and they go from a definite host to an intermediate host, back and forth, where the definite host is what's going to be where they do their sexual reproduction, and the intermediate host is going to be where they have their asexual reproduction. Now, you're very familiar with one of these, and that's the Plasmodium vivax, because it causes malaria in humans, and it uses the mosquito as its definite host. So we'll look more at the specifics of the various diseases we've discussed later in the semester. For this unit, just know those basic characteristics of the protozoa and what makes them animal-like. Remember the 4 different groups, what is their mode of motility, and a couple of those significant points that we have pointed out in the video and in your lecture notes. So let's talk about the last group, and it's the Animalia group, okay? And this one, within it, you're going to have one group known as the Helminths, which are the worms. So although worms in of themselves are multicellular animals, and so these are animals, they are going to be eukaryotic though, because they are animals, and they are multicellular, which means they have full tissue development, digestive, circulatory, etc. So why then are we looking at them in microbiology if they're multicellular organisms? It's because sometimes the helminths, because of their cycles and their eggs, etc., the egg portion is actually microscopic, and oftentimes what gets into the humans, and they can be human pathogens. So therefore, because part of their life cycle is microscopic and does get into the humans, we do look at them at a broad base for microbiology. Now, there are going to be 2 main groups, and just like with the algae and the protozoa, this is an introductory chapter, and we're just looking at knowing some of their very basics. So what are the groups and what makes them fall within those 2 groups? So we have the Platyhelminthes and the nematodes. So the Platyhelminthes, they are the flatworms, and everybody's like, I can't keep this apart. And I tell everybody that when I was learning how to do it, to me, I saw the word plate for plate instead of plathy, but it was plate, and to me, I think of plates as being flat. So the Platyhelminthes are your flatworms, and there's two different kinds of flatworms. You have your trematodes or your flukes, and you have your cestodes and your tapeworms. So the trematodes have leaf-like bodies, and they're going to have suckers or scollexes for attachment and sucking out fluids. And then, of course, oftentimes they're going to be named for their host themselves. The cestodes are your tapeworms. They have segmented bodies made out of what we call the protoliths, and they too have a scollex for attachments. And so you've heard of tapeworm infections and things along those lines. And then we have the nematodes. The nematodes are the roundworms, and they're called roundworms because they have cylindrical bodies. They do have a complex digestive system. They are parasitic, and usually if you get infections, it's because you're getting from their larvae or their egg states, which are microscopic. So for those helminths, just learn the basics that we discussed, the different groups between the Platyhelminthes, there are two groups of those, and then the nematodes. And that concludes the last of our videos.